Every war has a first shot. This one had a first shot fired by an empire 11,000 years old, at a species it had studied for less than a decade. By sunset on the same day, that empire understood exactly why it should have studied longer. The Skarn Ascendancy had never lost a war it started. 11,000 years of conquest had taught it one lesson above all others: strike first, strike hard, and let the enemy's fear finish what the first strike began. It had used this doctrine on 312 species. All 312 had knelt within a single season. The Ascendancy's capital world, Thrender Prime, held a monument in its central plaza listing every conquered species by name and by the number of days each surrender had taken. The average across 11,000 years stood at 11 days. The fastest surrender in Ascendancy history had taken 4 hours. Overlord Khan had studied that monument since childhood and had privately hoped before this campaign began to see his own name added beside a number smaller than 4. The doctrine had a formal name within Ascendancy military academies: the First Strike Principle. It held that any enemy allowed to organize a coordinated response before the opening blow landed would fight harder, longer, and more effectively than an enemy struck without warning. 11,000 years of data appeared to confirm the principle beyond any reasonable doubt, and no officer in the current fleet had ever seen it fail. At 600 hours Terran Standard Time, the Ascendancy struck Earth's outer defense perimeter without warning. No ultimatum, no demand for surrender, no broadcast at all. Overlord Threx Khan believed warnings were a courtesy owed only to enemies capable of answering them. He did not believe humanity qualified. His flagship, the Ascendant Will, led 4,000 warships out of a hidden approach vector behind the orbit of Saturn. Each ship carried weapons capable of leveling a continent in a single volley. The Ascendancy had used exactly this formation, this timing, and this silence to open every one of its 312 prior campaigns. It had never once needed to change the plan. Chronicler Ashen Drow, the Ascendancy's official war archivist, began his log the moment the fleet crossed into human space. He titled the file "The Fall of Saul" and noted the time precisely: 600 hours, first contact. He had titled 312 files exactly the same way before. Every one of them had been accurate by the time he closed it. Analyst Ren Kahlo, a junior officer aboard the Ascendant Will, had spent the last 2 years studying human military doctrine more closely than anyone else in the fleet. She noticed something the rest of the invasion staff had dismissed as irrelevant. Human colonies had gone almost entirely quiet 40 years earlier, with no explanation ever offered publicly. She raised the concern in a written brief. Her superior marked it insufficient evidence and filed it away without a second read. The Ascendancy's opening bombardment targeted 3 orbital stations above Earth, structures its scouts had identified as the extent of humanity's visible defense network. Marshal Odaris Venn, second in command of the invasion fleet, gave the order personally. "Level them," he said. "Let the humans see exactly what waiting 80 years to notice them has cost us in patience." The first volley struck at 6:11 hours. All 3 stations went dark within 4 seconds. Overlord Khan watched the readout with the flat satisfaction of a man who had seen this exact result 312 times before. He did not yet know that all 3 stations had been evacuated 19 hours earlier, their crews long gone, their value already spent as bait rather than as a defense. The decision to evacuate those stations had been made 11 years earlier, written into Project Solstices, standing orders long before anyone could know exactly which day the invasion would come. Terran Defense Authority accepted, from the very first draft of the plan, that some visible losses would be necessary to keep the Ascendancy believing its opening strike had worked exactly as designed. The 3 stations were rebuilt twice over the decades, always in the same visible orbits, always evacuated the moment Solstice sensors detected an approaching fleet. Humanity's true answer to the strike was not visible yet. It was waiting, exactly where it had been waiting for 40 years, behind the dark side of the moon. Overlord Threx Khan addressed his invasion council aboard the Ascendant Will 20 minutes after the first strike. The holographic map at the center of the room showed Earth glowing green, marked with a single word, undefended. By sunset, Khan said, this world kneels, as all the others have. Marshal Venn agreed without hesitation. Their stations offered no return fire. Their ground defenses have not activated. This will be the shortest campa in Ascendancy history. Khan allowed himself something close to satisfaction. 11,000 years of unbroken conquest had made moments like this feel almost routine. Routine was, in hindsight, the most dangerous word in the entire Ascendancy vocabulary. Commissar Yura Vext, the fleet's ranking intelligence officer, was the only voice at the table who did not share the confidence. 3 stations destroyed with no return fire is not a sign of weakness, she said. It is a sign that those stations were never meant to be defended. Venn dismissed her with a wave of one hand. You have said this before every campaign for the last decade, Vext. You have been wrong every time. Vext did not back down. I have been wrong about timing. I have never been wrong about intent. Khan considered her words for exactly as long as protocol required, then set them aside. 11,000 years of victories had given the Ascendancy a great many things. Patience for doubt was not one of them. Vext pressed once more, because it was her duty to, even when no one at the table wanted to hear it. In 11,000 years, has any species we labeled as declining ever gone silent instead of collapsing loudly, the way declining species always have before? No one answered her. The silence that followed the question was the closest thing to agreement the room offered, and it was not a comfortable one for anyone present. The council adjourned without resolving the disagreement, and Khan ordered the invasion to proceed exactly on schedule regardless. 11,000 years of unbroken victory carried a gravity of its own, and even a careful commander found it difficult to resist entirely once the fleet was already committed. He added a single line to the invasion order that had never appeared in any of the Ascendancy's 312 prior campaigns. Proceed, but confirm every assumption before the ground assault begins. The Ascendancy broadcast its terms into Earth silence within the hour, the same terms it had offered 312 times before. Kneel, and your species will be preserved as a labor caste. Resist, and your world will be reduced to debris within one rotation. The broadcast repeated on every frequency the Ascendancy's linguists had ever recorded from human transmissions, decades old and never updated. No answer came. Khan took the silence as confirmation, exactly as 312 prior campaigns had trained him to. Analyst Ren Kahlo, watching the same silence from her station, reached a very different conclusion. She had read enough human history to know that silence, for this particular species, had never once meant surrender. It had usually meant the opposite. Aboard the troop carrier fleet, Ascendancy soldiers prepared for what they had been told would be a simple occupation landing rather than a real fight. Ceremonial restraint gear, designed for processing surrendered populations, was issued in place of heavier combat equipment that commanders judged unnecessary for the task ahead. It was, in hindsight, a small and telling arrogance all its own, one repeated in some form during every one of the Ascendancy's 312 prior campaigns, and never once corrected because it had never once mattered before. At 700 hours, Marshal Venn ordered the main invasion force to begin its descent toward Earth's atmosphere. 3,000 troop carriers, escorted by 1,000 warships, began their approach through a sky the Ascendancy still believed was empty. Behind the moon, 40 years of human patience finally began to move. At 7:15 hours, 60 human interceptors rose from a hidden launch complex beneath the Rockies, climbing to meet the descending Ascendancy carriers. Ascendancy sensors classified them instantly as primitive atmospheric craft, no threat to void-capable warships. Marshal Venn did not even bother ordering a change in formation. He simply told his gunners to clear them on the way past. The 60 interceptors did not engage the warships at all. They struck the troop carriers directly, each one firing a single precision weapon that ignored Ascendancy shielding entirely. 40 carriers lost engine power in under 6 seconds, not destroyed. Grounded, mid-descent, forced into a slow, uncontrolled drift toward the upper atmosphere. Marshal Venn watched 40 carriers go dark on his display and felt, for the first time in his career, an unfamiliar and unwelcome cold settle into his chest. "Report," he demanded. His tactical officer had no clean answer to give him. "Weapon signature does not match any known human technology," she said. "It bypassed shielding as though the shielding were not active at all." Venn ordered the remaining carriers to abort descent and pull back to orbit, the first retreat order any Ascendancy officer had given on this campaign. One of the 60 interceptor pilots, a veteran officer named Major Renata Suarez, had trained for this exact opening M.O. for 9 straight years in simulation. She gave the order to disengage calmly, the way a soldier gives an order she has rehearsed 10,000 times before. "Confirmed 40 carriers disabled," she reported. "0 interceptor losses, withdrawing to rally point as planned." Marshal Venn ordered a second wave of 20 escort warships to pursue the retreating interceptors, certain that a larger force would finally punish the small human squadron for its earlier success. The 20 warships closed the distance rapidly, weapons hot, expecting the interceptors to scatter and run in genuine panic. They did not scatter. They peeled apart in a rehearsed pattern, drawing the pursuing warships into a wider formation that placed distance between each Ascendancy hull. Aboard the Ascendant Will, Overlord Khan received the report with a stillness that unsettled his own bridge crew more than any shouted order could have. 60 craft, he said quietly. 60 craft disabled 40 of our carriers without losing one of their own. Commissar Vext, standing at his side, did not say "I told you so." She did not need to. A single transmission reached the Ascendancy fleet moments later. Human voice, level, unhurried. "This is Terran Defense Authority. You have fired the first shot. You will not fire the last one." Khan muted the channel and turned to his council. The room that had been full of confidence 20 minutes earlier was now full of silence. He ordered the full invasion fleet forward regardless, all 4,000 warships committing to the assault at once. 11,000 years of doctrine did not bend easily, even for a man who had just watched his opening strike fail in 6 seconds. The 20 pursuing Ascendancy warships, still chasing the scattered interceptors, found themselves suddenly isolated from the main fleet formation by nearly 200,000 kilometers of open space. Major Suarez's squadron regrouped without warning and answered with a second coordinated volley, precise enough to disable 11 of the 20 pursuers before the remainder could break contact and retreat. Marshal Venn called off all further pursuit within the hour, the second retreat order he had given before the main engagement had even properly begun. Behind the Moon, behind Mars, behind 100 quiet stations no Ascendancy scout had ever catalogued, something far larger than 60 interceptors began to power on. Analyst Ren Kahlo watched the new signatures bloom across her sensor display and understood, with a certainty that made her hands go cold, that the war had only just begun to reveal its actual shape. "Sir," she said to Marshal Venn, "those are not 60 ships anymore." Overlord Khan finally understood, 29 minutes into what he had planned as a single afternoon of conquest, that Earth had never been undefended. It had been waiting for exactly this moment. 40 years earlier, in a bunker carved into bedrock beneath the Rockies, a woman named Director Mayaril Costa signed the founding order of a project with a name chosen to mean nothing to anyone who might intercept it. Project Solstice. Its charter contained a single line: ensure that when the Empire comes, it finds a sunrise and leaves by sunset. No one outside a small circle of officials ever learned that line existed until the day it was finally proven true. 41 years before the invasion, a deep space listening post picked up an anomalous signal on the edge of the solar system, a single burst of encrypted ascendancy chatter that should never have reached that far. The technician who caught it, a quiet analyst named Devrim Ansari, escalated the finding through every channel available to him within a single night. By morning, it had reached Costa's desk, and by the end of that week, Project Solstice existed. Costa understood something the Ascendancy never accounted for. A species given even a small warning would use every year of it. Public colony expansion halted. Shipyards vanished from official record. An entire generation of engineers and soldiers disappeared into classified postings under cover stories no one outside the project ever questioned closely. 40 years of silence followed, indistinguishable from the outside to weakness, decline, or collapse. It was none of those things. Costa's original briefing to the small council of world leaders who approved the project lasted less than an hour, but one exchange from it was recorded in the founding minutes and read decades later by every officer eventually cleared into the program. A skeptical council member asked her plainly what would happen if the signal she had found meant nothing, and 40 years of resources were spent preparing for a war that never came. Then we will have built the safest, quietest 40 years in human history for the cost of our patience alone, Costa answered. I can live with that outcome. I cannot live with the alternative. That single answer became, in a quiet way, the closest thing Project Solstice ever had to a motto, repeated in briefings for 4 decades afterward. Better a wasted 40 years than an unanswered morning. No one who lived through the battle that followed ever again suggested those 40 years had been wasted. Deep beneath 3 separate locations, hollowed lunar caverns, a converted asteroid renamed Solstice Anchor, and a hidden shipyard built into the ice of Europa, humanity constructed a fleet the Ascendancy never once detected. 6,000 warships, built in total secrecy across 4 decades, armed with a weapon designed around a single captured fragment of Ascendancy shield technology recovered from that first intercepted signal's origin point. The weapon's designer, Dr. Elias Thorne, spent 17 years studying that single fragment before he found the flaw that made it obsolete. Solstice Anchor alone produced 2,500 of the 6,000 warships, its shipyards running continuous rotating shifts for 36 uninterrupted years. The lunar caverns and the Europa shipyard split the remaining production between them, each specializing in a different hull class, so that no single location ever held more than a third of the total fleet at once. That distribution was deliberate, a precaution against exactly the kind of single decisive strike the Ascendancy's own doctrine always favored against an undefended enemy. Keeping the secret intact for 4 decades demanded its own quiet discipline. 3 separate attempts by rival factions within human government to expose the project's true scale were intercepted and contained before they reached public record. Supply lines were disguised as asteroid mining operations. Engineers were told, officially, that they were building deep space research platforms that would never see active service. It was not one lie that protected Project Solstice for 40 years. It was 10,000 small, forgettable lies, repeated patiently, year after year, until no one questioned them at all. Thorne's discovery was simple in principle and devastating in practice. Ascendancy shields were built to stop energy and matter. They were never built to stop a weapon that briefly stopped existing in normal space entirely, only to reappear on the other side of the barrier meant to block it. Human engineers called the weapon a phase breach cannon. It did not go through a shield. It simply arrived where the shield could not follow. Every one of the 60 interceptors that struck first carried a scaled-down prototype of that same weapon, built specifically to prove the concept before the main fleet committed to battle. The first working prototype of the phase breach cannon destroyed its own test rig during a demonstration 11 years into the research program, an incident Thorne described afterward in his private notes as the day the math finally stopped arguing with me. It took another 6 years to scale the weapon safely enough to mount on a full-sized warship, without risking the same catastrophic feedback that had destroyed the original test rig. By the time the first production model was installed aboard a Solstice fleet cruiser, Thorne had spent more years perfecting a single weapon system than most Ascendancy engineers spent on their entire careers. Every Solstice fleet warship carried between 4 and 12 phase breach cannons depending on hull class, each one drawing enormous power that limited how quickly a ship could fire in sustained combat. Human tacticians built the entire Solstice battle doctrine around that single limitation, favoring precise, disabling strikes over sustained barrages that the fleet's power reserves could never have supported for long. It was, in its own way, a doctrine built entirely around patience, the same quality that had defined every other part of the 40-year project that produced it. Thorne's work nearly ended the project twice, for reasons that had nothing to do with the enemy at all. A containment failure in his lab during the 9th year of testing killed 2 junior engineers and came within hours of forcing an evacuation that would have exposed the entire Solstice anchor location to public inquiry. A supply audit 2 years later flagged unusual power draw from his section, and only a hastily rewritten cover report kept outside investigators from asking questions the project could not yet afford to answer. Director Costa did not live to see the invasion. She died 9 years into the project, her final instruction to her successor written on a single card kept in every command bunker since. Do not celebrate the silence. Protect it. Her name was never made public. It did not need to be, for the plan she built to succeed exactly as designed. The final ship of Project Solstice, a command vessel named First Light, launched from Solstice Anchor 11 months before the Ascendancy's opening strike, waiting quietly for a war its crew had trained 30 years to fight in a single day. Admiral Naomi Cross, commanding officer of First Light, received confirmation of the Ascendancy's attack at 6:02 hours, 2 minutes after the first shot struck Earth's outer stations. She gave a single order to the 6,000 ships of the Solstice fleet, gathered in silence behind the Moon, Mars, and 100 stations no enemy chart had ever recorded. Project Solstice, she said, is no longer a secret. Bring the sunset early. At 7:30 hours, while the Ascendancy fleet reeled from its first true losses, most of Earth's population remained entirely unaware that a war for their planet's survival was underway at all. 40 years of secrecy did not lift the moment the first shot was fired. It lifted only for those already cleared to know, and that circle remained small even as the battle above them grew. Ordinary people went about an ordinary morning, unaware that the outcome of the next few hours would decide whether they had an afternoon at all. In a small farming town 300 kilometers from the nearest Solstice shipyard, a retired teacher named Grace Odom watched the sunrise from her porch without any idea that her granddaughter, an engineer assigned to First Light for the last 6 years, was at that exact moment overseeing the ship's reactor output during the opening minutes of the fiercest battle in human history. Grace had stopped asking detailed questions about her granddaughter's classified posting years earlier, after learning that questions were rarely welcome and answers were never given. She simply trusted, in the quiet way that families of secretive people learn to trust, that the silence meant something worth protecting. Terran Defense Authority maintained a strict information blackout through the entire engagement, releasing no public statement until the outcome was no longer in doubt. This was not deception for its own sake. It was the same discipline that had built Project Solstice in the dark for 4 decades. A frightened population reacting in real time to an unfolding invasion could do more damage to itself than the invasion ever could, and Costa's original charter had accounted for that risk from its very first page. A handful of amateur observers across the planet noticed unusual light patterns near the moon that morning, faint flashes too distant and too brief to identify with civilian instruments. Several posted about it online, speculating about meteor showers or satellite debris, and were met mostly with polite disinterest. No one connected those distant flickers to a war for the survival of their species, because no one had been given any reason to imagine such a war was even possible before sunrise that same day. At 7:45 hours, the Solstice fleet crossed into visual range of the Ascendancy Armada, 6,000 human warships rising from behind the moon in a single coordinated wave. Overlord Khan watched the tactical display fill with new contacts faster than his officers could label them. "Recalculate," he ordered. "Recalculate everything we know about this system." Admiral Cross gave the order Project Solstice had trained 30 years to execute. Solstice Fleet, phase breach formation, target their shield generators and their engines. Nothing else. 6,000 human ships moved as one, and the Ascendancy Armada finally understood what 40 years of silence had actually purchased. The first full volley crossed the dark in under 3 seconds. Ascendancy shields, built to stop conventional energy and kinetic weapons, did nothing against a weapon that did not need to pass through them at all. 200 Ascendancy warships lost primary power in the opening exchange. Not destroyed. Blinded, exactly as the 60 interceptors had blinded the carriers less than an hour earlier. "Return fire," Khan ordered, and 4,000 Ascendancy warships answered with everything they had. The exchange lit near-Earth space like a second sunrise arriving hours early. Human shields held, not without cost, but they held, layered with armor beneath every generator on the assumption that no shield lasted forever in a real fight. Captain Dax Rourke, commanding the frontline cruiser Vigil, watched his own ship absorb 3 direct hits before its shields finally buckled. "Hold formation," he told his crew, voice level despite the shaking deck beneath him. "We are not here to survive alone. We are here to survive together." The Vigil held its position, plating scorched but hull intact, and kept firing exactly as 30 years of drills had trained its crew to do. Commissar Vext watched 3 Ascendancy cruisers vanish from the tactical display in the same instant, and said the words she had been holding back for a decade. "They knew our shield frequency before we ever fired a single shot," she said. "They have known it for years." Khan did not answer. He was already calculating how many decades it would take to close a weakness this precise, and the number was larger than he wanted to admit. Aloud. By 8:30 hours, the human fleet had organized itself into 3 rolling waves, each one relieving the last before Ascendancy gunners could adjust their aim to compensate. The first wave struck engines. The second wave struck shield generators, still reeling from the first hit. The third wave struck sensors, blinding whatever remained standing after the first 2 passes. It was a rhythm rehearsed so many thousands of times in simulation that human pilots executed it now, without needing to speak to one another at all. An Ascendancy battlecruiser named the Endless Dawn, third in seniority within the entire invasion fleet, attempted to break formation and ram a human cruiser directly rather than continue trading disabling fire it could not win. Its captain believed, correctly, that raw mass alone might succeed where precision weapons had already failed twice that morning. 3-phase breach cannons found its engines before it closed half the remaining distance, and the Endless Dawn drifted dead in the dark, its captain watching helplessly as the battle moved on without him. Near the center of the engagement, an Ascendancy strike group attempted a final, desperate maneuver, concentrating every remaining weapon on a single human cruiser in the hope of breaking the human formation through sheer overwhelming force. The cruiser, a vessel named the Farsight, took 9 direct hits in under a minute, more damage than any single human ship had absorbed in the entire engagement. Its shields failed. Its hull held, layered with armor beneath every generator on the same assumption that had saved Captain Rourke's Vigil 20 minutes earlier. Shields eventually fail no matter how well they are designed. The Farsight drifted, wounded and smoking, but never broke formation, and the Ascendancy strike group that had spent everything to break it found itself exposed and undefended when 3 fresh human cruisers arrived to answer in its place. Within 90 seconds, the entire Ascendancy strike group was disabled, its gamble having cost the Empire far more than it had ever threatened to cost humanity. It was, in the words later used by Terran Defense Authority's own after-action report, the moment the battle stopped being a fight and became simply a matter of time. By 900 hours, 90 minutes into the engagement, half the Ascendancy fleet had lost primary power or been destroyed outright. Human losses stood at 140 ships, a fraction of what Khan had expected to inflict, let alone lose. The battle that had been planned as a single afternoon of conquest had become, in less than 2 hours, the worst single engagement in Ascendancy military history. A young Ascendancy officer aboard a crippled cruiser broke protocol and opened a private channel to a nearby human vessel, more out of desperation than strategy. "Why disable us instead of destroying us?" he asked through a badly aging translation filter. "Your weapon could end this in seconds." The human reply came back short, almost gentle in its bluntness. "Because an enemy that survives goes home and tells the truth about what happened here. We would rather you remembered than feared." Aboard First Light, Admiral Cross monitored the entire engagement from a command deck built specifically for this single day, 30 years earlier, by engineers who never expected to see it used. She gave few orders directly, trusting instead in 30 years of drilled coordination between ships that no longer needed her to specify targets or timing. Her only standing instruction throughout the battle, repeated once at the start and never again, was simple: disable what threatens us. Destroy only what refuses to stop. At 10:30 hours, Overlord Threx Khan made the decision no Ascendancy Overlord had made in 11,000 years of recorded history. "Sound the withdrawal," he said, the words scraping against a throat that had never once needed to say them before. His officers stared at him in open disbelief. The Ascendancy did not withdraw. The Ascendancy had never needed to. Commissar Vext, the one voice at the table that had doubted the invasion from its very first briefing, was the first to support him. "It is not weakness to save an armada rather than lose it entirely," she said. "It is the only decision that leaves us an empire to return to." Khan looked at her for a long moment, grateful, for the first time in the entire campaign, that someone aboard his ship had refused to simply agree with him. The withdrawal order reached what remained of the invasion fleet by 10:45 hours. Just under half of the original 4,000 ships were still capable of hearing it. Behind them, the Solstice fleet did not pursue beyond the edge of the system. It let them run. That restraint, too, had been part of the plan since Costa's very first draft of the charter. Every human ship that fought at the edge of the solar system that day carried a crew who had spent years, sometimes decades, prepa. Ring for a single morning. Lieutenant Sierra Voss, whose cruiser held its line through the worst of the engagement, later described the battle in a single sentence during her official debrief. "It felt exactly like the drills," she said. "Except the drills never sounded like that, and the drills never left an empty seat afterward." Human losses across the entire engagement totaled 186 ships and just under 6,000 personnel, a number Terran Defense Authority made public in full within a week of the battle, rather than hold it back the way some officials had originally proposed. Every name was read aloud, once, in a memorial broadcast that ran for 4 uninterrupted hours across every human colony and settlement. It was the first time in 40 years that the true human cost of Project Solstice had been spoken about openly, and it would not be the last. Captain Dax Rourke, whose cruiser Vigil had held the exposed center of the formation through the worst of the fighting, requested to attend as many of the memorial readings in person as duty allowed. He managed just over 100 before he was called away again, and kept the remaining names written on a card he carried afterward for the rest of his career. When asked why, years later, he gave the same answer every time. Because a war ending in 8 hours does not mean the war was free. It only means someone paid quickly instead of slowly. Analyst Ren Kahlo, reviewing captured human broadcasts in the weeks that followed from an Ascendancy debriefing room, found herself struck by how little humanity's public mourning resembled anything in Ascendancy tradition. There were no monuments built to celebrate the victory, no ceremonies honoring the Ascendancy's defeat, only names, read slowly, one at a time, for 4 uninterrupted hours. She noted, in her own private report, that a species capable of mourning that precisely was a species that remembered exactly what a war cost, and a species that remembers costs rarely rushes carelessly into another one. The Ascendancy withdrawal cleared the edge of the solar system by 1400 hours, less than 8 hours after the first shot had been fired at dawn. Fewer than 2,000 ships limped home, carrying damage no Ascendancy fleet had suffered in 11,000 years of unbroken conquest. Overlord Khan sat alone in his command chair aboard the Ascendant Will, replaying the battle in silence, searching for the exact moment the war had already been decided. He found it easily enough. It was not a moment during the battle at all. It was 41 years earlier, in a signal his own fleet had accidentally allowed to travel farther than intended, and a follow-up investigation that was recommended and never approved. The Ascendancy had handed humanity its warning without ever meaning to, and had never once checked whether that warning had been noticed. Analyst Ren Kahlo, whose early concerns about human silence had been dismissed weeks before the invasion, was summoned before Khan personally in the hours after the retreat. "You noticed the silence before any of us," Khan said. "How?" "I did not assume that quiet meant weak," she said. "No one else in that briefing wanted to imagine 40 years of patience from a species we had already decided was beneath us." Marshal Venn requested a private audience with Khan during the return voyage, his earlier confidence entirely gone. "How long were they planning this?" he asked. Not really a question, more a confession of disbelief. 40 years, Khan said. An entire generation of humans who never saw our first scout signal and built for it anyway on nothing more than the chance that someone had. Ascendancy intelligence, working from salvaged wreckage and intercepted human broadcasts, slowly assembled the full truth over the following weeks. Project Solstice had consumed nearly the entire industrial capacity of human civilization for 4 decades. Built around a single accidental signal, the Ascendancy itself had leaked without ever realizing it. Every quiet colony, every unreported shipyard, every year of silence the Ascendancy had read as decline had, in truth, been a species forging a weapon in complete secrecy, waiting for a war it could not be certain would ever come. Chronicler Ashen Drow, who had titled his log "The Fall of Saul" before a single shot had been fired, sat with the file open for a long time before he finally renamed it. He considered several titles. Most of them felt too small for what had actually happened in a single morning. He settled in the end on 5 words: "The sunset we did not see coming." It became required study for every new Ascendancy officer within the year. "They let us see 60 ships first," Venn said, understanding arriving too late to matter. "They let us feel confident enough to commit everything. They let us commit our entire invasion force in the opening hour," Khan said. "If we had sent a smaller force and turned back at the first sign of trouble, we would have lost a smaller force. We sent everything and lost more than half of it before noon." It was, by every metric the Ascendancy measured victory, the single worst defeat in the Empire's 11,000-year history. Across 312 conquered worlds, word of the defeat spread faster than the Ascendancy could contain it. Species that had knelt without resistance for centuries began, quietly, to ask questions they had never dared ask before. If humanity could do this after 40 years of preparation built from a single accidental signal, what might other silent species already be building in corners of the Empire no one had thought to watch? On a conquered world nearly 400 light-years from Sol, an elder of a species called the Varun, who had surrendered to the Ascendancy 2 centuries earlier after a much shorter and much bloodier resistance, heard the news through smuggled channels and said only one thing to his grandchildren that night. "Perhaps quiet was never surrender," he said. "Perhaps we simply stopped counting the years too soon." No one repeated that sentence to any Ascendancy official, but it traveled between conquered worlds faster than any fleet ever could. Chronicler Ashen Drow, reviewing reports from 3 minor garrison worlds in the weeks after the battle, noticed unusual radio silence from populations that had been fully compliant for generations. Ascendancy Command dismissed the reports as coincidence, exactly as it had dismissed Analyst Kahlo's early concerns before the invasion began. Drow was no longer willing to dismiss anything as coincidence. He flagged all 3 worlds for follow-up investigation, and for the first time in his career as archivist, his recommendation was actually approved without delay. The Ascendancy's ruling council convened an emergency session within days, the first such session in over a century. One delegate, representing a world that had surrendered without resistance 300 years earlier, asked the question that silenced the entire chamber. If a single leaked signal was enough for this species to prepare an armada in 40 years, she said, how many other silent worlds have we simply assumed were harmless, without ever checking whether they were only waiting? The chamber debated for the better part of a full day, longer than any single session in over a century of Ascendancy governance. Several delegates argued for an immediate second invasion, larger and better prepared, to erase the humiliation before word of it spread further across the empire. Others, a smaller but growing number, argued that a second hasty strike against an enemy this well prepared would only compound a single afternoon's disaster into a generational one. Commissar Vext was called to testify alongside Khan, and her account carried more weight in that chamber than any report she had filed in the decade before the invasion. "I did not predict the size of their fleet," she told the council plainly. "I predicted only that a species capable of going silent for 40 years without a single leak was a species worth taking seriously before we ever fired the first shot. That much, at least, I got right." Her testimony was entered into the permanent Ascendancy record, the first time in her career that a warning of hers outlived the meeting in which she gave it. Khan was summoned to testify before that council in person, the first time in his career he had ever been called to answer for anything other than a victory. He answered honestly, including the parts that reflected poorly on his own judgment. "We assumed silence meant surrender because it always had before," he told them. "It will not always mean that again. I recommend every future contact with a quiet species be treated as a contact with an armed one until proven otherwise." The council did not vote for an immediate second invasion. It voted instead, by a narrow margin, to authorize a full review of every world in the empire that had gone unusually quiet in the last century. It was a small motion, procedurally speaking, buried near the end of a very long session. Historian records would later describe it as the single most consequential vote the council had passed in over 1,000 years. By 1400 hours, with the Ascendancy fleet already withdrawing beyond the edge of the solar system, Terran Defense Authority made a decision that surprised even its own senior officers. Rather than release an immediate public statement celebrating the outcome, Command waited until the last damaged Ascendancy vessel had cleared the system boundary, confirming the retreat was genuine rather than a tactical pause. Only then did Admiral Cross authorize any information to reach the wider public, a final act of the same patience that had built Project Solstice across 4 decades. Grace Odom, the retired teacher whose granddaughter served aboard First Light, first learned that anything unusual had happened at all when her town's emergency broadcast system activated at 17:30 hours, 30 minutes before the promised public statement. She did not yet know her granddaughter had spent the entire day monitoring reactor output during the single most consequential naval engagement in human history. She would not learn the full details of that service for another 2 years, once the relevant records were finally declassified in full. Engineers and soldiers who had spent decades inside Solstice Anchor, the lunar caverns, and the Europa shipyard finally received permission to speak openly about their work for the first time in their careers. Many found they did not know how to begin. 40 years of practiced silence had become, for some of them, simply a part of who they were rather than a rule imposed from outside. Dr. Elias Thorne, the weapons designer, gave a single brief statement to Terran Defense Authority's internal record and declined every request for a public interview that followed. "I built a tool," he said. "I would rather people remember the ones who used it well than the one who made it." No formal victory parade was ever organized. Terran Defense Authority instead authorized a single, quiet policy change that took effect within the month: the declassification, gradual and careful, of Project Solstice's full history, so that the sacrifice behind it would be remembered accurately rather than mythologized into something simpler and less true. It was, in its own way, as deliberate a choice as the 40 years of silence that had come before it. By 1800 hours, the same day it had begun, the sun set over a solar system humanity still fully controlled. There were no parades, no public declarations of triumph broadcast across Earth. 40 years of silence had taught a species something most empires never learn in 11,000. Restraint is its own kind of strength, and speed is only useful when patience has already done the harder work first. Admiral Naomi Cross gave a single public statement that evening, 3 sentences long, broadcast once and never repeated. "We did not fire the first shot today. We made certain, 40 years ago, that we would not need to fire the last one either. The silence is over. Choose carefully what comes next." Overlord Threx Khan kept a single line from his own report pinned above his desk for the remainder of his command. He read it every morning, a reminder that an empire 11,000 years old had changed shape in a single day, without ever being asked for permission. Somewhere beyond the edge of the solar system, 6,000 human warships held their position, running lights steady, engines idle, patience entirely unbroken. Terran Defense Authority did not disband the Solstice fleet once the immediate danger had passed. It renamed it quietly and gave it a new mandate. Where Project Solstice had once existed to answer a single anticipated invasion, its successor program existed to answer whatever came next, whenever it arrived, from whichever direction the next warning finally reached them. 40 years of silence had taught humanity that the galaxy rewarded patience over panic, and no one in command was eager to unlearn that lesson simply because the first true test had been passed in a single day. Commissar Yura Vext, the one Ascendancy officer who had doubted the invasion from its very first briefing, was promoted in the aftermath, an unusual reward for a voice that had gone unheeded rather than followed. The Ascendancy, for the first time in 11,000 years, had learned to value a voice that doubted louder than a chorus that simply agreed. It was a small change, in the scale of an empire that spanned 312 conquered worlds, but small changes were, as humanity itself had just proven in a single morning, sometimes the only kind that mattered in the end. The Ascendancy would return one day. Every empire eventually does, but it would return knowing that behind every quiet world there might be another 40 years of silence, already counting down to a sunset of its own. Humanity had answered the first shot of a war 11,000 years in the making, and ended it before the sun went down.